Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at a historical and covenantal history of the Old Testament. Sort of looking at the Old Testament story, but with two different lenses. We begin with the historical approach, but chapters 1 through 11, I typically refer to as prehistory. Now, I don't mean by that it didn't really happen. What I do mean is that I'm not going to try to assign dates to the events in this section. Genesis 1 through 11 give us four events. We begin with the creation story. That's in chapters 1 and 2. We have two different accounts of creation in the same way that the New Testament gives us four different accounts in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John of the life of Christ. Well, we have two different creation accounts. They are complementary. They tell different aspects of the same story. Next, in Genesis chapter 3, we have the fall. I guess we could say even chapter 3 and maybe chapter 4 too. It's hard to know exactly when to divide that, but the fall into sin in chapters, the lead up is in chapter 5, but then chapter 6 through chapter 9 is the story of the flood, both before, during, and afterward. And then in chapter 10 and 11, 10 tells you what happened, chapter 11 tells you how it happened, the story of the Tower of Babel. Now, that's all what I call prehistory. And I'm not, if you ask me when did the creation take place or when did the Tower of Babel take place, I'm going to answer, I don't know. I think we're supposed to do more than just add up the begats, the genealogies. And we'll talk about that when we get there. Next, we have starting around 2000 BC. And notice I'm painting with a very broad brush, but I begin the period of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, starting around 2000 BC, going to around 1500. Then around 1500, I have the Exodus. Now, if you say 1400, that's okay, or 1440 or 1450, somewhere in there. I can get a little closer to the actual date. But again, I'm not going to try to be exact at this point. But the Exodus event, and then the Israelites go, the Sinai wanderings. And when we come to next to the period of the Judges, which brings us to around 1000 BC. Again, very broad brush. And I go from the period of the Judges to the period of the Kings, which will start off with Saul and then King David and Solomon. But after King Solomon, the kingdom of Israel will be broken up into two kingdoms. And so we'll have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. So notice kings of Israel and Judah, which takes me to close to 500. Here I can get pretty exact. 586 BC, date certain, or within a year at least, where the northern kingdom will already have been taken into captivity by the Assyrians. Date for that is 721 BC. And now in 586 BC, and if somebody says 587, that's okay. I'm not going to quibble over the year. But 586 BC will be the destruction of the temple, and the southern kingdom of Judah will also cease to exist. And they will, now we have the Babylonian captivity. But from the Babylonian captivity, after that, there's going to be a return. Notice it's not 500, a little bit earlier than that. So 539 BC, permission will be given, and they don't really get going right away, but eventually, within a year or so of that date, we will have some of the Jews coming back into the land, and that's where the story is going to end. They'll be back into the land after the Babylonian captivity, and I have the stories that are found in Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther. All three of those have portions of them taking place. Well, actually, they all take place after the Babylonian captivity. Ezra starts, where they're going to come back, and then Nehemiah picks up quite a bit later. And somewhere in there is also the story of Esther. Now, we have in the biblical story then, the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, are going to take us from the beginning, from creation, all the way through the Exodus and Sinai and going into the Promised Land. And then the historical books are going to give us everything else, from Joshua all the way to Second Chronicles, which will tell us about all the way through the return, and then Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. We already mentioned those. That's all part of the historical books. But that's not the entire part of the Old Testament. There's more Old Testament. So next we have the poets, the poetical books, and most of those are written. Now, I'm not talking about when any parts take place, like Job. We're not really told when that's taking place, but it seems to be written at a later date. Stories, first they take place and then they're written after the fact, sometimes right after the fact, sometimes many hundreds of years. So the poets are written during this period of the kings of Israel and Judah, up to and including the Babylonian captivity. For example, we have in Psalm 137, goes by the rivers of Babylon. We sat down and wept. Well, that's written during the Babylonian captivity, and possibly not collected until even after that. So that's the poets: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And next we have the prophets. Now, the prophets, you have prophets earlier than this, but they're not writing the written prophets like Isaiah and Amos and things like that. They're all writing during the period of the kings of Israel and Judah and during the period of the captivity, like Daniel and Ezekiel, and after the Babylonian captivity, and when they've come back into the land. And so I have Haggai and Zechariah and also Malachi. Those three books are what we would call post-exilic, after the exile. Now that's the Old Testament in both its writing and the historical framework when the books are written. But next, I want to take us to a covenantal history, and I'm going to start with a creation covenant where God gives a land. You say a land? Yeah, sure. He gives the Garden of Eden. That's a land. There's only two people, so they can fit. um, and but I call this a covenantal history, and I'm describing a creation covenant. And you say, well, I don't see the word covenant used in the early chapters of Genesis. I see it eventually in chapter 6, but I don't see it before that. Well, that's true. I don't see the word covenant used there, but I do see it later on in the book of Hosea, Hosea chapter 6 and verse 7, that says, "But like Adam, they have transgressed the covenant. There they have dealt treacherously against me." And God is speaking of Israel, about how Israel has transgressed the covenant, just like Adam transgressed the covenant. And that presupposes that Adam had a covenant to transgress. And so, creation covenant, I think that God is entering already, even though the word is not used in the early chapters of Genesis, not until Genesis chapter 6. It's not used before that, but I think there is this covenant idea, this covenant relationship, this community relationship. Remember how we described the thinking, the Western thinking versus the Eastern thinking, the collective versus the individualism. They were not individualistic in the same way we are in the West. They were more communal. And so it's a community covenant, even though the community was just one man, one woman, Adam and Eve. All right. Next, we have the Adamic covenant, where God enters into a covenant with Adam. Again, I don't have a specific verse on this. I think I see the idea where Adam is removed from the land. He's been given the land, but then after the sin, he is removed from the land. But God makes covenant promises with him in the process. Specifically in the closing verses of Genesis chapter 3. And we'll look at that and we'll see that. Now, those two, like I said, I don't have any place in Genesis in particular that reference those two by the word covenant. But when I get to the next one, and that is the covenant with Noah, God actually tells Noah, I'm going to cut a covenant. We'll talk about what that means later on. I'm going to make a covenant, going to cut a covenant with you. The Noahic covenant, God enters into a covenant with Noah and with everyone in the ark and with all life. It's not just with Noah. It's not just with Noah and his family. It's with the animals, with everything. And in this promise, he says, I'm going to renew the land. It's like starting over again. It's like hitting the reset button. And he is going to again give Noah some instructions that sound a lot like the instructions that were given to Adam. And he is going to send his spirit, to his wind, to remove the waters of the flood, just like the Spirit of God was moving on the waters in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2. It's sort of hitting a reset in that covenant. And God promises in that covenant, I will not destroy the world again by means of a flood. Now, he doesn't say I'll never destroy the world again, but not by means of a flood. And that there's going to be a considerable amount of time where day and night and month and seasons and all those things are going to take place. The covenant with Noah. Next, we have a covenant with Abraham. Now, that is first promised, and Abraham is given a sign, and then the covenant itself is actually made, entered into, cut. It doesn't all happen at the same time. It happens in process. But God cuts a covenant, makes a covenant with Abraham, which is then passed down. It becomes a family covenant, which is passed down to Isaac and to Jacob. And it's even passed down to the sons of Jacob. They are given covenant promises as well. So this Abrahamic covenant. And again, there's a promise of a land. It's not that first land. It's not Eden. They had been removed from that land. There's now been a renewal of the land, and a very particular portion of the land is promised to them, the land of Canaan. And that actually, you begin to see the development of that as early, before Abraham's even born, as early as Genesis chapter 9 at the end of the chapter. But now Abraham is born, and God cuts a covenant with him. Next, we move forward to the Mosaic covenant, where God enters into a covenant after he has brought his covenant nation, the descendants of Abraham. He's brought them out of Egypt. They have come into the wilderness to Mount Sinai, and there God enters into a covenant with the Israelites, and he gives them blessings and cursings. This is both in Leviticus and again in Deuteronomy, where, and that's covenant language. The blessings and the cursings, we're going to see, that's actually part and parcel with a covenant. And blessings if you keep the covenant, cursings if you break the covenant, and they are very, very involved. They're the big so what in the book of Leviticus. So the Mosaic covenant. Next, we have the Davidic covenant, where God enters into a covenant with David. And this is a covenant not with all of Israel. This is a covenant with David and his particular descendants, his seed, if I can use that term. Where God says, David, you and your descendants will be kings, a whole group of kings. I'm going to bless you in a special way. You're going to lead my people. Now, there's a call. You have to obey me. You have to, there's covenant responsibilities. And if you don't, I'm going to discipline. I'm not going to take it away. This is going to be fulfilled in spite of disobedience. It's not that disobedience will be ignored, but it will be paid for. The covenant stipulations, if the covenant is broken, there's some bad things going to happen. But the covenant somehow, and he doesn't explain exactly how yet, but somehow it will endure into an eternal covenant. Now, sure enough, and so this is the king over the land. And sure enough, David's descendants do not obey, even starting with Solomon. There's some disobedience there, but it gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And finally, they are removed. Both Israel in the north and Judah in the south are all removed from the land, and there are no more kings. And so there's a removal from the land, but God promises, he makes this promise that even if I remove you, I will return you to the land. It won't be a final, complete, and everlasting removal. There's going to be a return, and sure enough, they come back. Not all of them, just a remnant, but there are those that come back. And the question is, have they come back spiritually or just physically? And as we get toward the end of the Old Testament, actually there's a promise they will come back inside and not just outside, not just physically, but there's going to be a spiritual return too. But there's also a promise of a new covenant and a king who comes and dies and pays the penalty himself for the disobedience of the covenant breakers. And that's the story that's really fulfilled in the New Testament, where Jesus is the fulfillment of both that Davidic covenant. He is the seed of David, the promised one, And he is the one who comes to bring the hearts of the people back to the Lord. And he is the king who dies for his people. And not just for his people. You see, what he does is he sends his disciples and he says, go make disciples of all the nations, where they will all be my people. Israel, Jesus says, is going to get a lot bigger. This isn't a matter of God taking the promise from Israel and giving it to somebody else. No, this is a matter of Israel receiving the promise, but Israel getting much, much bigger, so that even Gentiles are brought into this covenant. And that is something that's promised in the Old Testament, but we don't see that fulfillment until we get to Jesus and after the death, the burial, and the resurrection. So, new covenant. And this is the king who dies for his kingdom. Now, one last chart we want to look at, and this comes to me compliments of my senior pastor, TJ Campo. I think he might have drawn it from somewhere else. He's not much into charts, but so one time he actually dedicated this to me, and I'm going to take it and sort of own it. Notice we begin with creation over on the left, and everything throughout the Old Testament is going to move in the direction of the cross. God had given a promise back in Numbers chapter 14, verse 21. Indeed, as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. And so what we see is in these covenant promises that we've been looking at, God promises a people. He promises that they will have a land. He promises that they will be made into a nation. And he promises them a king. Those are the covenant promises that we saw leading all the way up to the Davidic covenant, right? Um, and notice how everything focuses closer and closer. At the beginning in the Old Testament, people are scattered all sorts of places, and then God chooses one man, and he gives them one land and one nation and one king. And the further you go into the Old Testament, everything is drawing you closer and closer. Even when they are scattered in the Assyrian and then the Babylonian captivity, it's always a return to the land, a return to this place, a return to the place where God is, a return to the temple. Remember how eventually a temple is built in Jerusalem, and the promises are all focused in and around Jerusalem, coming to this one building, the place where God has manifested his glory. Notice, as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory. But the glory starts in the temple. When God shows up, he had showed up back in the book of Exodus in the tabernacle, but here once the temple is built, he shows up in the temple. But then his glory removes itself from the temple in the Babylonian captivity. And the question now is it going to come back? And there's a promise. There's a promise in the book of Malachi. God says, I'm going to come back. I'm going to come back to my temple. I'm going to be there again, but not yet. But not yet. And when we get to the New Testament, the promise is extended not to just a people, but to all people. All people can come and be a part of that. They can sort of join up with the God of Israel and with the people of Israel. And it's not just all people. Remember what Jesus says, go into all the world and make nations of all the nations. So the world and all the nations. And it is not just a king. Jesus is the king. He is the fulfillment. He is the ultimate king who's going to be king of all the universe. So remember how Numbers had said, indeed, as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. John in the Gospel of John, chapter 12, Jesus had said, if I be lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men to myself. And so in Jesus, we have the one he is the temple. He said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. He is the temple. He is the vine, that which you must be connected to. The vine in the Old Testament was a picture of Israel. But no, in the New Testament, you find out that he exemplifies that. He is the vine. He is the servant of God. And he is the promised seed, not just a bunch of seeds. Paul makes this point in Galatians chapter 3. God didn't give the promise to seeds, plural. He gave the promise to the seed, singular. And Jesus is the seed, so that we have in him not just creation, but a recreation. where we bring it all back to submit, all back into submission to God through Jesus.